Russia has been at war with Ukraine for over 33 months, and today we examine the military situation there. I'm Julian Rupke, and this is BILD Situation Room. And we start again with footage from Saturday. There, Ukraine made it relatively clear that they are facing attacks on civilian infrastructure, especially high-rise buildings in Kyiv, like what happened again on Friday evening, no longer passively tolerated. We're looking at images from Kazan, a city over 1,000 kilometers away from the border to Ukraine. And we observe here in Kazan on Saturday, just one day following the Russian assault on a high-rise building in Kyiv, these Ljutyj-type kamikaze drones are flying quite deliberately and purposefully towards the high-rise structures throughout the city. They each impact the upper floors. Here, we can see an explosion occurring. We now see this explosion from another perspective, but we'll take a closer look in another video where we see that there are two explosions, so two drones hit the same house consecutively, one after the other. We just observed that one of the explosions more or less traveled in this particular direction, and now we can observe yet another explosion striking the same house at the top, causing significant destruction there as well. Another building came under attack, the so-called Manhattan Project here in Kazan, and was significantly affected. And here we also see how a Ljutyj drone purposefully flies to the upper floors. And shortly we'll see from another perspective that two drones also hit the same house one after the other. Here you can see it relatively well again. So here is the entry of the first Ukrainian drone, and here the second Ukrainian drone, which will now hit several floors lower. In that regard, it is almost to be ruled out that this is a coincidence, but it actually appears that the Ukrainian army intentionally targeted these high-rise buildings. To explain, Ukrainian activists say that allegedly soldiers of the Russian army lived here from the nearby military bases. Nonetheless, these are assertions that we unfortunately cannot verify from here. We are looking at more footage showing that Ukraine is now hitting strategic targets in Russia with their drones every day. We have recently received new footage from Novocherkassk, which is situated in the Rostov region. In this video, you can clearly witness a massive explosion that occurred last night. And we can see that ammunition appears to have been hit here, but that's not entirely clear because we also see something in the air that looks like flares or perhaps even fireworks. It's not entirely clear what Ukraine hit at this location. We observe a large and significant explosion occurred in Novocherkassk, which is situated just behind the border of Ukraine in the region of Rostov. This was also corroborated by numerous local residents who recorded and directly witnessed the explosion. However, it's still not entirely clear what was hit here. Some say ammunition, while others suggest it could also be other explosive materials, possibly in a factory, that were attacked in this location. Let's take a brief look at the map to better understand how far Ukraine has the capability to reach with its drones. And we've marked Novocherkassk here as mentioned in Rostov, so only about, in quotes, only about 200 kilometers behind the front line. And on the other side, we have Kazan up here, and that is quite a power demonstration by Ukraine because Kazan is far east, about 400 kilometers east of Moscow. And the distance from here to Sumy or also to Kharkiv stretches out to exceed more than 1,000 kilometers. That means the Ukrainians are making it clear we could hit Moscow if we wanted to. We could attack Moscow at any time. Apparently for political reasons, and because some Western countries are said to have interfered, it is not desired. Or perhaps Ukraine isn't permitted to do that. Nevertheless, we fly with our drones right past Moscow and then manage to strike about 400 kilometers further east, as we recently saw in Kazan. In other words, the Ukrainian government is making it quite clear that this missile and bomb terror, including last night with 73 Russian kamikaze drones that have landed in Ukraine or that were fired overall, some of which were probably shot down, Ukraine says it will no longer tolerate this terror, but now, with equal measure or at least with the same weapons system, striking back at Russian cities, and that also far behind the front. We arrive from Russia entering into Ukraine, making our way into the Pokrovsk region, and what we have here is some rather alarming and quite concerning footage of a Russian kamikaze drone. Namely a drone on a fiber optic cable. This means that we are now, and we will take a closer look on the map in a moment, in a situation where the Russians can bring their fiber optic drones with a maximum range of 8 kilometers into Pokrovsk. Have a look around here, and that's what the drone is doing now. It's simply just looking around. In the southeast of Pokrovsk, and we see here, for example, that there are still civilians around. Here, a woman is walking along with a bag, seemingly heading to her house, and we also notice that more civilians are attempting to leave the city. Let's just let it run for a bit to take a look at the whole situation. The whole thing is a bit surreal because the Russian drones could of course attack here with the RPG-7 warhead at any time. However, at least as the Russians claim, they only observed civilians present in this location at that particular moment. Here, for example, a shipping vehicle originating from Germany, where apparently a move or an escape from Pokrovsk towards the west is being organized. And the Russians in this video don't attack anyone, they just observe everything closely, trying to get a clearer picture of where the Ukrainian positions are located and determining where they will soon advance on the ground in the direction of Pokrovsk. I think we are seeing a power plant over here and additional vehicles that are moving around. And quite interestingly, the Ukrainian army has prepared. We just saw barbed wire. Now we also see these dragon's teeth here. This means the Ukrainians have apparently prepared positions here to defend against Russian vehicles on the ground. The question is, and unfortunately we have to ask, whether the Ukrainians are actually defending Pokrovsk on the ground or if they are, as just seen in Kharkov, building defenses everywhere. Set up lines, but then let the Russians move in relatively unopposed. We'll see about that. Definitely, really. Alarming footage here of the Russian army, which just shows that they are now capable of moving in Pokrovsk with these fiber optic drones. One could also be able to attack these civilian vehicles here, but there is of course always a bit of propaganda involved. They want to show that they have nothing against civilians, allowing them to flee from Pokrovsk, and then they come back later to try to take over this ghost town, this further depopulated city. Pokrovsk just had 65,000 residents, and currently only 5,000 are supposedly left, trying to take control of this ghost town. We want to look at that on the map as well, and we can see that just south of Pokrovsk, the Russian army has advanced very far, even moving past Pokrovsk. It's likely that this drone we just observed in the footage was launched from this location by Shevchenko. And we've seen them in this area, which means there are only, as we can see at the top of the map, only about 3 kilometers left between Shevchenko, which is now firmly under Russian control, and just the south of Pokrovsk. Consequently, it's no longer an issue for the Russians to fly here with various types of drones, enabling them to cause significant destruction, gather extensive intelligence, or even just conduct surveillance as they see fit. We'll take a look at more footage from a small town, which isn't marked here but is roughly located around here. This is Solon, and Solon is another place where the Ukrainians are likely preparing the defense right now. But we see that the Russians are also very close here. They have completely taken over Novotroyska and only need to move about 2 or 3 kilometers further to reach Solon. In Solon, it appears that the Ukrainian army has another Leopard 2A4 tank ready and waiting, prepared to defend the important strategic location and also the front line. However, this particular one was also detected by Russian surveillance drones and subsequently came under attack. And then, it appears, it was shot into a state of incapacity, though not completely destroyed. Here we see the Leopard 2A4 moving through Solon, a small village as mentioned, and we will soon see how first kamikaze drones, small quadcopter kamikaze drones, you can clearly see from the quality here that this isn't a fiber optic drone, but rather an FPV kamikaze drone controlled by radio signals as it flies right into the tank. And we then also see how, after he was abandoned, after the crew got to safety, how the Russians are now deploying another drone, specifically a Lancet type, and there we see it. Here is a Lancet drone, the propaganda video marks it too, which is about to fly down onto the tank here. That means they are attempting to destroy this tank using greater explosive power than these small drones possess before moving forward into Solon. And now we can see here that it has caught fire. This suggests that this tank is probably no longer usable. It's still possible for the Ukrainians to evacuate him, but there is currently no evidence for that. That's the situation around Pokrovsk, where it's getting more precarious for the Ukrainians. The good news is Pokrovsk remains completely under Ukrainian control, even though the Russian army had already advanced right up to the city 6 months ago. The bad news is we have this flanking formation that the Russians consistently prefer. That means that the Russians are trying to encircle or circle around or even past the city. Consequently, Russian troops are now in both the east and south of the city, complicating the supply to Pokrovsk. A city that has already been taken by the Russians is Kharkov, and we have new footage that unfortunately shows us that due to the very rapid Ukrainian retreat, when the fighting directly reached the city, that due to this situation, a large part of the infrastructure is still such that the Russians can use it for their own hideouts. That means we see that I believe this is a gas station or something similar in the southeast of the city, that this entire infrastructure is currently being used by Russian soldiers. We can even see various cars parked here. That means there are many, many opportunities for the Russians to hide here and plan their attacks from this location, to attach their antennas for the FPV drones here. And we see these large housing complexes. In Vovchansk it looks completely different. In Kharkiv they were completely destroyed. They're all still standing here, and accordingly it's easy for the Russian army to hide here. And the Ukrainians are then trying accordingly with kamikaze drones to target every Russian soldier they see anywhere. Here also a lookout position of some sort, a surveillance position on top of a high-rise building which was taken over by the Russians. And of course, on one hand, Russian soldiers are also repeatedly being killed here. We observe further drones here, grenades being dropped from these drones. On the other hand, there are just as many opportunities available for the Russians and numerous structures that still remain in place to conceal themselves and then make further advances towards the west, thus creating an extremely challenging and complex situation for Ukraine. Here the first step is to drive out the Russians who have taken over the city, and because the Russian army did not destroy the city before they captured it, it is now up to Ukraine to bomb every single hideout, shelter and command center that the Russians are building in this former town of 18,000 inhabitants. And that is, of course, quite bitter when you see that Ukraine has to destroy Ukrainian infrastructure so that the Russians can't gain a foothold here. We have another video from the Kharkov region, specifically from the town of Dhakna. This is the next town, or at least the next place that is still under Ukrainian control, west of Kharkov. And these recordings interestingly show us that, of course, even for the Russians, despite their propaganda always claiming so, not everything is going well with these kamikaze drones. Since we think the Russians always show, yes, we're all here, we have control, we can decide. We have so many drones and so much explosive power and so on that we can decide who do we attack, how often do we attack. As seen in Pokrovsk, we observe the whole thing closely. Of course, the situation differs for the Russians. We see it here with an M109 howitzer, a self-propelled gun of the Ukrainian army threatened by kamikaze drones. We see the two propellers left and right, regular FPV kamikaze drones attacking by the Russians. And we can see here quite clearly these are the impact sensors. So we see one goes that way, one is round here, and one goes over there. So this is the first drone currently moving towards this M109, and right now it is directly approaching next to, well, at the turret positioned right next to the main gun here. So we're seeing this here at the last moment. This means the Russians want to suggest they have already hit this piece, this artillery gun, the mobile artillery gun, and have now caused initial destruction here. But now we see in the edit that we have another FPV kamikaze drone, and if we look at this we can see it's not the same one, so a different form of impact sensor. And this drone is now flying to the same gun, trying once again to cause destruction here. And we see, if we look closely, this is the same location that we just had, and there's absolutely no destruction visible. That means the first drone did not detonate here, it didn't work, it was a failure to fly all the way over here. Instead, a second drone needs to be deployed here to cover the same section of this entrenched artillery. And you won't believe it. There is also a third drone, which likewise attacks this position, this gun. Here, the wires are a bit further down this time, slightly hidden from view. Nevertheless, we're now seeing the third attack on the same location, and again, we see no damage. That means the two projectiles that just landed here, that flew in a moment ago, assuming they even exploded, certainly did not cause any visible damage to this M109 artillery gun. And this clearly shows us that even with Russian sources, every video we present must be carefully analyzed with a necessary degree of distance, because it does not necessarily mean, just like with the Ukrainians, that it was also a success, but it was only a success if we have a surveillance drone or if we can see the whole thing from another perspective and can prove it accordingly, that this kamikaze drone attack did lead to results. We're moving on to discuss the situation in the Kharkiv region, where unfortunately there is new concerning news about the current state of affairs for the Ukrainian army. It's still fresh in our memory how just a week ago the Russians made an attempt to cross the Oskil River. This Oskil is kind of a natural barrier, especially between Russian-occupied areas and Ukrainian-held areas in Kharkiv. And we regret to inform you that the Russian army has managed once again to succeed in crossing the Oskil River and establishing a strong foothold on the banks of the western side. And this time, not like last time in a forest section, so in a section where the Ukrainians, we had also watched the videos, had cleared the area, drove in there and drove the Russians out. They then always returned. The survivors across the Oskil But this time they went to Dvorichna, and Dvorichna is a place directly north of Kupiansk. By analyzing these Ukrainian recordings here, we can demonstrate that this location is presently partially under Russian control. This specific location by the Oskil River on the western bank was similarly taken by the Russians. Ukraine was not monitoring so heavily and not holding so tightly so that the whole shore is secured, but it appears that there were so few soldiers stationed here that the Russians successfully managed to stealthily enter across the river, move to Dvorichna, and occupy houses there. And now the Ukrainian army has the massive problem that, for the first time since November 2022, they have a first location on the west bank of the Dnipro, which is held by the Russians. Which one now? Accordingly, with kamikaze drones, grenade-launching drones, and if one wants to reclaim it, then also with ground troops in this place must attack, to advance here against the Russian soldiers, who are currently being targeted and attacked from the air initially. Here are the recordings, and we'll take a closer look at it on the map, because it's truly a challenging and difficult situation for the Ukrainians. If the Russians manage to establish a foothold here, and even advance north from this point, we would indeed be facing the dire situation that from Dvorichna, as mentioned, I can highlight that again briefly, so the east value, also marked here again, is the river that runs along here. In this area, it continues. Should we find ourselves in the unfortunate scenario where the Russians execute a flanking move from Dvorichna southwards towards Kupiansk, then the Ukrainians would indeed be in a significant predicament, who have thus far successfully managed to hold this bridgehead here on the eastern side of the east part relatively well. But if the Russians are now attacking from the north or advancing on both sides of the river, then it's a situation where from Kupiansk, the logistics for these just over 10 villages which are held on the eastern side probably could not be maintained at all anymore. Thus, once again, a significant problem for Ukraine is the lack of men, the scarcity of fighters at the front, despite having the means to kill Russians on both sides of the eastern bank, but lacks the ability to defend the whole west bank of this river in Kharkiv when not in the Donbass to defend in Kharkiv. Let's take a moment to watch one final video, which might hopefully bring us a little bit more optimism. In Zaporizhzhia, in the country's south, the Russian army has tried to advance in recent months. And you're heading towards Zaporizhzhia city. 700,000 inhabitants once lived here. Currently, approximately 500,000 people are still residing there today. In this area, they have made further advances and have largely taken over control of the small town of Kamjanska. And these recordings, precisely the opposite of what we saw just a moment ago, these are Russian recordings which clearly demonstrate to us that the Russian army is currently attacking Kamjanska once again. That they're attacking here with kamikaze drones, artillery, and so on. Here we can clearly see the impacts which very convincingly show that the Russian forces were definitively expelled and pushed out from Kamjanska, meaning that the Ukrainian army has successfully and fully regained control of this small village. This means that even if it is just a very small recapture, we are talking about approximately 300 meters, then it is at least a small hope for Ukraine, which has managed to stop the ongoing dynamic of retreating step by step, gradually moving northwest, results in an overall withdrawal as Russian forces are consistently advancing from the southeast, further pressing the overall situation. To turn back, and here, apparently, Ukrainian soldiers are moving around the center of Kamjanski again. Let's take a quick look at the map. To understand the context here, we are no longer quite in the southeast of the country, but we are south of the city of Zaporizhzhia. That means we have now marked the different locations. And here, roughly, is where Kamjanski is located, another place where there was a lot of fear in recent days. That the Russians, alongside their advance here at Kharkov, alongside their advance here at Pokrovsk, alongside further advances near Chasiv Yar, and also, as we saw above, near Kupiansk, pointing out that there is still another Russian offensive unfolding here, at least a small one, advancing step by step with small movements within the settlements and persistently pushing the Ukrainians further back. At least here in Kamjanska, this maneuver was successfully reversed by the Ukrainians after a few weeks, resulting in the entire village being back under solid Ukrainian control.